Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
My name is Elena Vance, and I'm 33 years old. I'm a logistics consultant in Norristown, Pennsylvania. My father took every cent of my inheritance and used it to pay off my brother's gambling debts. Julian got the fancy degree. I got a stack of withdrawal forms. Julian got the vintage Porsche for his 21st birthday. I got a bus pass and double shifts at the diner. He sat in the corner office with the river view, but I got a metal desk in the basement next to a rattling boiler that leaked rust. The Norristown Country Club ballroom carried the scent of lilies and fresh floor wax. Massive crystal lights hung from the ceiling, throwing a sharp white glare over 500 people in stiff tuxedos. I sat at the very back, at a table near the kitchen doors. Waiters kept hitting my chair with their elbows, but I didn't move. I just watched. Arthur Vance stood at the podium. He looked like a powerful king in his custom suit. He tapped the microphone, and the room went dead quiet. "Vance Freight has been my life for 40 years, Arthur said. His voice was thick with the kind of pride he only ever showed for the business. But a captain needs to know when to let go of the wheel. He pointed to Julian at the head table. Julian straightened his silk tie and flashed a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like someone who had won a race. He never actually ran. "I've spent my life building a name," Arthur continued. He looked down at Hissant Ease for a second, his face softening for just a moment. "I've made hard choices and cut away the things that didn't help the future of this family. I did it all to make sure the Vance name stayed strong." My throat tightened, as if I'd swallowed a handful of dry sand. I reached for my water glass, but my hand stayed still. I remembered being 22. I was standing in the hallway of the registrar's office at Penn. The air was heavy, with the scent of old paper and wet umbrellas. "Your father took back the money, Elena," the clerk told me. She didn't look up from her computer screen. "You have 48 hours to pay the bill or leave your dorm." I had 2 weeks left until my final exams. I walked out into the rain and never went back. Arthur told me later it was a smart business move. He said Julian's startup was a better place for the money, even though that company went broke in 6 months. "A company needs a leader, not a burden," Arthur told the crowd. He finally looked toward my table, but he didn't see me. He looked right through me. "Julian has the vision to lead us. And Elena, well, Elena has always been our anchor, a weight we've had to carry while we tried to fly." People in the front rows laughed. Julian leaned back in his chair, looking smug. He knew exactly what that anchor comment meant. It was the same lie they'd told the relatives for 10 years. Elena was the failure. Elena was the one who couldn't finish school. Elena lived in a tiny apartment while they lived in mansions. I sat at the back table, watching the shadows dance on the white tablecloth. The applause for Julian was a physical weight, but I didn't move. I remembered the nights I spent in my studio apartment, eating cold soup and mapping out supply chains on a cracked laptop. I had built a life out of the scraps they threw away. Now I was just a ghost at my own family's feast, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. The room exploded with clapping as Arthur handed Julian a gold key. Julian held it up like a trophy and started a speech about new ideas and big dreams. He didn't mention that the warehouse rent was 3 months late or that Arthur took out bad loans just to keep the lights on. I reached into my silk bag and pulled out my phone. A single message sat on the screen from my main guy at Apex Optimization. "The papers are signed," it read. "You own 60% of the Vance Freight debt. You are the one they owe now." I looked toward the back of the room, near the heavy oak doors. Silas Thorne was standing there. He was the only person in the room who knew the truth. He wore his silver glasses and held his old leather briefcase close to his side. Silas was my mother's lawyer before she passed. He was the one who told me about the secret trust my grandmother left me. He helped me turn that small bit of money into a shipping empire while my father was busy calling me a loser. I caught the lawyer's eye. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just looked at him. Arthur stepped away from the podium and hugged Julian. Cameras flashed. The golden child was finally king of a house made of cards. They thought they were celebrating a crowning. They didn't realize they were at a funeral. Silas adjusted his glasses and moved toward the side of the stage. He tapped his briefcase twice. That was the signal. The anchor was about to cut the rope. Would you have stayed silent during that speech, or would you have walked out? Let me know in the comments. Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. The aftermath of the laughter was a ringing silence in my ears. I slipped out of the ballroom and headed for the back offices. The hallway was dim, and the air felt cooler away from the crowd. Julian leaned against the dark wood paneling, tugging at his silk tie. He had that look on his face, like he'd already spent every dime of a check that hadn't even cleared yet. "Hell of a night, sis," he said. He didn't bother looking up. "Try to wipe that look off your face. You're ruining the pictures." I stopped right in front of him. "You can't even read a bank statement, Julian. You think a fancy title fixes the fact that the Fairfield warehouse is bleeding 40 grand every month." Let out a short, mean laugh. "Dad's right about you. You're just mad because you couldn't cut it. Some people are born to run things. Others are born to stand on the sidelines and watch." "You aren't running anything," I snapped. "You're just standing on top of a pile of Dad's screw-ups." He pushed off the wall and got right in my face. He smelled like top-shelf scotch and sweat. "I'm the boss. You're just the girl who couldn't even finish college. Learn your place, Elena." I didn't argue. There was no point. He was a king of nothing, wearing a crown made of his father's lies. I watched him walk back toward the party. He moved like he owned the world, even though he didn't own a lick of sense. I thought about Grandma Rose. 10 years ago, we sat in her bright kitchen. It always smelled like lemon wax and peppermint tea. She held my hand tight. "Arthur builds walls to hide how small he feels, Elena," she'd whispered. "He's scared to death the world will see he's just a man who got lucky one time. You build your own wall, one brick at a time. Don't let him see the cracks until it's too high for him to climb." I found Sela's thorn in the library. The room was chilly and smelled of old paper and dust. He sat by the window with his tan leather briefcase resting on his lap. "I need to see the final numbers on my mother's trust, Sela's," I said. He didn't look surprised. He reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I figured you'd come asking sooner or later." My stomach turned. I stared at the numbers on the page. It was a receipt for $240,000. The money had been moved from my mother's life insurance straight into an account for Vance Tech Ventures. That was the tech company Julian crashed and burned 5 years ago. A total wreck. "He stole it," I said. "He took my money to pay off Julian's debts and that fake company." Silas gave a slow nod. "He didn't think you'd ever check. He told me you wouldn't understand the paperwork even if you saw it." I sat in the big velvet chair while Silas waited. The house was quiet now. All the guests had gone home in their shiny cars. I thought about the years I spent working 3 jobs. I slept on a mattress on the floor because I thought we were broke. I remembered how it felt to tell my teachers I couldn't pay for school. It wasn't bad luck. It was a theft. My father traded my life for my brother's pride. He did it while calling me a burden. I looked up at Silas. "He really thinks I'm that dumb." Silas pushed his glasses up his nose. "He told the board you weren't smart enough to follow the money. He thinks the girl at the bottom of the lake doesn't know how to swim." I stared at that receipt one last time. The ink looked like a slap in the face. "I've been keeping a notebook," I said. "Every dollar, every date, every lie." I laid the paper on the desk. The library door creaked. A long shadow stretched across the rug. Someone had been standing there the whole time. If you found out your father stole your future to save your brother's ego, would you confront him right now or wait until you could take everything he has left? Tell me your move in the comments. This is the story of how I became the silent architect. The long shadow in the library doorway belonged to Julian Vance. He leaned against the heavy wood frame, slowly swirling a glass of dark whiskey that cost more than my monthly rent. He looked at the crumpled paper in my hand and laughed. It was a rough, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. The room smelled of old books and his expensive cologne. "Still obsessed with the past, Elena?" he asked. He took a slow sip. "Dad's right. You're like a dog with a bone that's been buried for years. Give it up. The money's gone. It's helping the family business now." I tucked the receipt into my pocket. Is that what you call your failed tech project, a business? Julian's face darkened. He stepped toward me, his breath smelling like high-end scotch and old bitterness. I'm the one running the show now. You're just the girl who couldn't handle the pressure. Go back to your little apartment and leave the hard work to the men. He turned and walked away, his heavy boots thudding on the hardwood. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Julian thought he was the king of the hill, but he didn't realize the hill was made of dry sand. That was the start of what I call the building years. For 3 years, I lived a double life. By day, I worked as a dispatcher for a local trucking company. It was a small, windowless office that smelled like diesel fumes and stale, burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering every few minutes. The phones never stopped ringing. By night, I sat at my kitchen table with a laptop I'd bought second-hand from a pawn shop. I spent hundreds of hours on free online courses. I mastered how trucks move and how to save time while the rest of the world slept. My back ached from the cheap plastic chair, but I didn't stop. I was building a clock, and I was tired of being the battery for everyone else's life. I met Silas Thorne 6 months into my journey. He wasn't a driver or a mechanic. He was a man who knew how to find the cracks in a stone wall. He had a gravelly voice and silver-rimmed glasses that always seemed to reflect the data on my screen. He carried a tan leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 100 boardrooms and 1,000 fights. "You're looking at the numbers all wrong," Silas said one evening, pointing at my notebook. "You're trying to fix the trucks. You need to fix the time." Arthur Vance doesn't understand that time is the only thing he can't buy back. Silas became the only person who knew what I was doing. He didn't offer money, but he offered a way to make my father pay. With his guidance and $2,000 I'd scraped together from overtime shifts, I launched a company called Apex Optimization. I used a fake name, E.V. Sterling. I didn't want my father's shadow falling over my work before I was ready. The irony was delicious. Vance Freight was losing money because of Julian's bad ideas. They put out a call for an outside auditor to fix the mess. I applied through a shell company. For 18 months, I secretly fixed my father's failing business. I was the one finding the lost roots. I was the one cutting the waste. I was saving the company that had kicked me out, and they were unknowingly paying me $15,000 a month to do it. I checked the bank balance every morning. It felt like winning a war they didn't know we were fighting. I sat on the floor of my studio apartment one Tuesday night. The only light came from the street lamp outside and the blue glow of my laptop screen. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that hadn't thing to do with hunger. I was 30 years old, and my entire life was a secret. I thought about the Sunday dinners I wasn't invited to. I thought about the way my father looked at Julian with pride, even as Julian drove the business into a ditch. I was the one holding the wheel from the shadows, and nobody even knew I was in the car. It was a lonely kind of power. I wondered if I was becoming just like Arthur, valuing the win more than the people. But then I remembered the receipt in my pocket, and the ache turned into cold iron. I was digging through the digital files late one night when I found it, the real secret. I thought the $240,000 from the trust was the end of it. I was wrong. I found a series of consulting fees paid out to a company called Rosewood Holdings. The address for Rosewood was a P.O. box in Delaware. The owner wasn't Julian. It was Arthur Vance. My stomach dropped. My hands felt like ice. He was gutting the company from the inside. He was selling off the warehouses, the trucks, and the land to himself for pennies. He was planning to go bankrupt, leave the workers with nothing, and walk away with a new empire in his own name. The screen flickered. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. The phone on my desk buzzed. It was a private number. I hesitated, then picked it up. "Elena," my father's voice boomed. He sounded happy the way he did when he was winning a bet. "I'm at the club with the board. We were just talking about that firm we hired, Apex. The boss, this sterling fellow, is a genius. He's doubled our profits in a year. I told the board I want to bring him in-house. Give him a real seat at the table." I gripped the edge of the desk. "That sounds like a big move, Dad." "It is," he said, his tone shifting. "Which brings me to why I'm calling. I had Julian check your old room for some files. He found that notebook you mentioned, the one with the numbers. The air left the room. I couldn't breathe. I don't like people snooping in my house, Elena, Arthur said. His voice was no longer happy. It was a low, dangerous growl. I've talked to a few people in the industry. If you keep looking for things that aren't there, you'll find it very hard to get a job in this town. Or any town. Do you understand me? I understand, I said. Good. Stay in your lane, daughter. I've worked too hard to let your imagination ruin this family. He hung up. I stared at the screen. The total amount he had moved into Rosewood Holdings was nearly $4 million. It was the entire future of every person who worked for him. The stakes were no longer about a stolen trust fund. They were about a total collapse. Arthur Vance is ready to welcome a ghost into his inner circle, completely blind to the fact that he's inviting his own daughter to take his throne. If you were Elena, would you reveal the truth now to stop his theft, or keep the mask on until he has nothing left to lose? Choose your side in the comments. The air in the dining room was tight enough to snap. My throat was dry as a bone while I sat at the heavy wood table for Sunday brunch. The scent of thick-cut bacon and sweet syrup usually meant home, but today it was a trap. Arthur set his coffee cup down. The ceramic hit the saucer with a sharp crack. Julian found your little notebook, Elena. Very imaginative, all those numbers and dates. I didn't look up from my plate. It's not a story, Dad, it's math. It's a hobby, Arthur said. He bent forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. And it's over. Julian needs help at the office. You're going to work as his assistant. You'll fix his schedule and straighten out his files. I met his gaze and simply said, no. The room went silent as Arthur gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. What did you say? Arthur asked. I'm done cleaning up after him, I said. I turned to Julian. How is the shipping contract coming along, Julian? I heard the clients are acting tough. Julian shifted in his chair. He wouldn't meet my eyes. They are just playing hardball. It's a small detail. Is it? I asked. Or is it because you can't explain where $4 million went? Arthur slammed his hand on the table. The spoons jumped. That is enough. You'll do what I say, or you'll find out how fast the money runs out. I'll end the lease on your place by morning. Your insurance, canceled. You'll be sleeping in your car, Elena. I stood up. I didn't have the fear I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, quiet stillness inside. Do what you have to do, Dad. I don't need your permission anymore. I walked out before he could yell. I didn't go back to my place. I drove straight to see Sila's Thorne. The old lawyer was waiting, his glasses sitting low on his nose. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He did it, Elena, Silas said. He pushed a thick folder across the desk. Your dad filed a legal block against the logistics group this morning. He's claiming they stole his secrets. He thinks they took his shipping codes. I stared at the white pages. He's suing the company that's trying to save him. He's suing me. He doesn't know it is you, Silas said. But the judge doesn't care about that. The order is broad. It locks up all the money until a hearing. You can't even pay your staff. The air left my chest. I had 40 people working for me. 40 families who needed a paycheck by Friday to pay their bills. By trying to kill a rival, my dad was cutting my throat by mistake. I left the office and drove back to the big house, but I didn't go in. I parked near the side window of the library. Through the glass, I saw Arthur. He didn't look like a king anymore. He was slumped in his chair, holding a picture of my mother. As I watched, a shadow moved near the library door. Julian was standing in the hallway, watching our father with a look of cold calculation that made my skin crawl. He wasn't there to comfort him. He was waiting for the crown to fall. I rolled down my window. The night air was wet and cool. I could hear Arthur's voice through the gap in the glass. I didn't know what else to do, Clara, Arthur whispered to the frame. His voice cracked. It was a sound I had never heard from him. The debt is too deep. I'm trying to save the family name. I'm trying to leave something for the boy. He looked small. For a second, I wanted to run inside and tell him I could fix the mess. I wanted to tell him the company was mine and we could be a team. My hand even touched the door handle. I almost wiped the files off my phone. What was the point of winning if it left an old man sobbing in the dark? I sat there for a long time. The house was quiet. I thought about how it used to be. Summer of 2009. My mother was still healthy then. She braided my hair on the porch while fireflies blinked over the lawn. The air carried the scent of cut grass and her lavender perfume. "You're the pretty one," she whispered, tucking a loose strand behind my ear. "And the smart one. Don't let them make you feel small, Elena." I believed her then. That girl would hate who I'm becoming. She wouldn't understand the hard stone in my chest. I put the car in gear and pulled away. My face was wet. I wasn't mad anymore. I was just sad. I was mourning a man who never really existed and a family that was already a ghost. What would you do if the one you trusted most turned out to be a stranger? Would you keep fighting, or would you walk away to save your soul? Tell me your thoughts in the replies. If you're still here, I'm guessing you're feeling the same way I was. What would you do in this situation? Tell me in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. The boardroom of the Norristown Chamber of Commerce carried the scent of scorched coffee and industrial floor cleaner. It was a square box devoid of windows, where the overhead lights emitted a relentless hum. The low-frequency vibration grated against my nerves, making my back teeth ache in sympathy. Arthur Vance occupied the head of the long, dark wood table. His deep gray suit appeared to cost more than my first truck. Julian Vance lounged in the adjacent chair, leaning back while tapping a gold pen against his chin. He projected an air of total boredom, as if this entire proceeding were merely a tedious chore to be finished before his lunch reservation. Silas Thorne occupied the seat at the far end of the table, his knuckles white as he gripped a brown leather bag against his knees as if it were a shield. My throat was parched, as if I had been swallowing sand. I took a small sip of lukewarm water from a plastic cup, the only movement I allowed myself. I hadn't brought a legal team or a phalanx of suits. I arrived with nothing but a single blue folder and a memory that refused to fade. "We are here because someone stole from us," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the 3 board members across the table rather than on me. "This new firm has been siphoning the confidential shipping plans from our family business. They are parasites. They are attempting to dismantle a reputation that took 40 years to cement." A board member with sharp, rectangular glasses turned her attention toward me. "Ms. Vance, you are identified in these documents as a person of interest. Your father alleges you have been operating on behalf of the opposition." "I haven't been working for anyone else," I replied, my voice steady. Julian Vance let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Then why were you spotted at their headquarters, Elena?" "Dad is trying to preserve the family legacy while you're over there playing double agent for some faceless boss we haven't even identified yet." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes bloodshot and heavy with fatigue. "I did what was necessary, Elena. I locked those accounts to secure the boys' future. I'm trying to keep this family afloat. You couldn't possibly grasp the weight of that responsibility." He sounded utterly drained. For a fleeting moment, I recognized the parent who once hoisted me onto his shoulders when I was a child. He genuinely believed he was the hero of this story. He thought he had to incinerate everything I owned just to protect a son who couldn't manage his own bank balance. "You're right, Dad," I said, flipping open my blue folder. "I don't see things through your lens, but I brought my own documentation today." I slid a heavy ledger across the polished wood. It wasn't a digital file. It was a physical book with paper pages, crowded with dates and figures recorded in permanent ink. "That ledger tracks every cent you diverted from my mother's estate," I stated. "You funneled it into Julian's tech startup back in 2018. It also proves that the shipping plans you claim were stolen were actually sold. Julian brokered them to a third party 6 months ago." Julian's pen went still. His complexion shifted to the color of curdled milk. "That is a fabrication," Arthur roared, slamming his palm against the table. The water in my cup shivered. "Who provided this? Who is the coward behind that new firm?" I stood up, and the room plunged into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. I met my father's stare and held it. "I am the owner of the Apex Group." I sat back down. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, but I remained anchored. I traced the grain of the wood on the table, remembering the countless hours I had spent in rooms exactly like this one, waiting for someone to acknowledge my presence. I considered the 40 employees currently on my payroll who relied on me. I reflected on the secret I had guarded for 3 long years, a massive weight to carry alone. This was supposed to be a victory, but instead, it merely mirrored the exhaustion of a long walk home in the rain. The space reeked of my father's signature cologne and the metallic tang of his rising fear. I realized in that moment that I didn't want his title or his chair. I simply wanted him to see me. Now he couldn't look anywhere else. Silas rose to his feet then. He reached into his bag and retrieved a stack of documents bearing official embossed seals. He circled the table and placed them before the board. "These are the founding legalities for the firm," Silas said, his voice deep and gravelly. "The company was established with capital from a private trust. Grandma Rose set it up years ago. She anticipated the direction this family business was heading. She chose Elena to keep the flame alive." Arthur snatched the papers. His hands trembled so violently that the pages rattled. He stared at the signature on the ownership line. "E. Vance," he whispered. I thought it was some corporate raider from the city. I thought someone was trying to hijack my life." "I wasn't trying to take anything," I said. "I was trying to repair what you broke." A memory surfaced. 2013. I was huddled in the basement of the college library. The air held the tang of parchment and stagnant dust. I had $4 in my account and a legal pad overflowing with equations and strategies. I had whispered to the empty bookshelves that I would build something untouchable. I had survived on caffeine and sheer will. My heart had ached because Arthur told me I lacked the instinct to lead. That girl in the basement would be proud of the woman I am now, but she would also be heartbroken that it required this much destruction. The woman in the glasses cleared her throat, glancing from Arthur to me. "Mr. Vance, you are pursuing litigation against a corporation that belongs to your own daughter. According to these records, her firm is the primary reason your company hasn't collapsed this fiscal year." Arthur looked at me. For the first time in my life, the disappointment was gone. It had been replaced by terror. "Elena," he said, his voice thin and cracking. "I didn't realize. I was only trying to look out for the boy." "I know," I said. I stood and gathered my folder. There was no reason to remain for the conclusion of the meeting. The damage was absolute. The truth was out in the open, scorching everything it touched. I walked toward the exit, Silas following close behind. His heavy soles echoed sharply against the hard flooring. "What happens now?" Silas asked once we reached the corridor. "Now we see who is still standing when the smoke clears," I replied. I checked my watch. The sun was dipping behind the skyline, casting elongated shadows across the pavement. The dinner starts in 3 hours, and I was missing one vital folder. Would you have stayed to watch him fall apart, or would you have walked away? Tell me what you would do in the section below. The hearing fell apart in a heartbeat. Julian was on his feet before the door even clicked shut behind the board members. His face was a blotchy, angry red. "You were spying on us," he shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You've been inside our systems for months, Elena. That's illegal. I'll have you arrested." I didn't blink. I didn't even raise my voice. "I wasn't spying, Julian. I was working." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Working? You haven't had a job in years." "I'm the one who built the routing tools your dispatchers use every morning," I said. I stepped toward the long table. "I fixed the delivery routes in the valley to save 30% on gas. I'm the one who caught the stealing in the parts shop last fall. I didn't need to snoop. I wrote the lines of code that keep this place moving." Julian's mouth hung open. He looked at Arthur, searching for a lifeline, but Arthur wasn't looking at him. The old man was staring at me as if he were seeing a phantom from the past. "Everyone out," Arthur said. "Dad, she's lying," Julian stammered. "She's just trying to—" "Out," Arthur roared. Julian flinched and scrambled for the door. Silas Thorne followed him, giving me a slow, serious nod as he closed the heavy oak doors. The room went quiet. It smelled like the sharp cedar cologne Arthur used to hide the fact that he was getting old. My stomach felt heavy, as if it were full of lead. This was the man who had told me I wasn't smart enough for the family business. The man who took my inheritance to pay for Julian's mistakes. Why? I asked. The word felt small in the big room. Why did you do it? Why did you spend 10 years trying to convince me I wasn't a thing? Arthur sat down heavily in his seat. He looked smaller than he had at the party. He looked tired. You look exactly like your mother, he whispered. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Rose's daughter. She had this way of looking at a ledger and seeing the truth before I could even end a sentence. It made me feel unnecessary. And then you started doing the same thing. You were 20 years old, and you were already better at this than I ever was. He finally looked up. His eyes were wet. I knew if I let you into the company, you'd be the one in charge within a year. I couldn't be the man who worked for his own daughter. I had to be the one who provided. I had to be the king. I thought if I gave it to Julian, I could still be the boss. He needed me. You never did. I sat with that for a moment. He had sabotaged my entire life because his ego was too fragile to handle my talent. He didn't hate me. He was just afraid of me. I thought about 2013. I remembered sitting in that library basement with a few bucks in my pocket and a heart full of shame because he told me I was a failure. I spent a decade running from a lie he told to make himself feel tall. I watched him now, and I didn't feel the rage I expected. I just felt a deep, hollow kind of pity. His world was built on shadows, and the sun was finally coming up. I watched the dust dance in the light. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I had been holding onto. I didn't open it. I just set it on the table. I am pulling all technical support today. Arthur's face went gray. Elena, wait. Without that software, the shipping chain will break. We'll be bankrupt in 30 days. I looked at him, really looked at him for the last time. You told me to stay in my lane, I said. I finally found it. I didn't wait for him to answer. I didn't need to hear his excuses or his apologies. Understanding why he was cruel didn't make the cruelty go away. It just meant I didn't have to carry it anymore. I turned and walked toward the door. My heels made a steady, sharp sound on the floor. I didn't look back. I had a dinner to get to, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going as a guest. I was going as the owner. Would you have given him a second chance, or would you have walked away? Let me know what you would do. Karma didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a series of phone calls. I sat in my corner office at the new firm and watched the numbers crawl across the monitors. One by one, the big accounts for the old family business were lighting up my screen. Miller Logistics, the Fairfield Group. They were coming to me. I didn't have to pitch them or beg for their time. They had seen the news. They wanted a leader who actually knew how to keep a truck on the road. They wanted a person who understood the grit of the highway, not just the view from a penthouse. He's still waiting out there, Sarah said as she stepped into the room. She set a steaming mug of brew on my desk. The scent of roasted beans and stability filled the air. How long? I asked. 2 hours, she said. He hasn't touched the water I gave him. He just stares at the logo on the lobby wall. I gave a short nod and turned back to the charts. The wild rush I expected never came. Instead, a sense of calm, heavy focus settled over me. I spent the next hour checking the last few deals for our move into the neighboring states. This growth was fast, but the foundation was thick concrete. It wasn't a shaky stack of cards like the one Arthur spent 40 years propping up. He had spent his life hiding the cracks. I spent mine making sure there weren't any. It was right. I finally hit the button on the desk. Send him in. The door swung open. Arthur walked into my office. He didn't look like the king of the county anymore. His custom suit hung off his frame as if it belonged to someone else. His white hair was messy, sticking up in the back. He stopped in the center of the rug. He looked at the glass walls and the sharp black furniture. Nice place, he muttered. I stayed quiet. I let the silence sit between us until it grew heavy. He dropped into the chair across from me without an invite. He leaned in, putting his spotted hands on the polished wood of my desk. The bank called today, Elena. They're calling in the loans on the big house. They're going to put the manor on the market. I watched him. I didn't give him a single word. That place has been ours for 3 generations, he said. His voice shook just a little. The roses your mom planted are starting to show. If we lose it, the next people will rip them out for a swimming pool. You have the cash. You could buy the debt, save the roof you grew up under. My mind went back to 2015. I was on the back porch of that big house in Fairfield. The air carried the scent of mown grass and the pricey plant food Arthur loved. I had just handed him my plan for a small shipping firm. He didn't get past the first page. He told me I was born to be a typist. He said my only job was to help Julian win. He didn't even look me in the face when he crushed my dreams. He just went back to his drink. It was a cold memory. I already took pieces of the roses to plant, I said. Arthur blinked. What? I went by last Sunday, I said. The guy who tends the yard let me in. Those flowers will grow just fine at my new house. He sank into the leather. The look on his face was honest. He wasn't faking it. He was someone who had built his entire life on a pile of bricks and a name on a sign. Now both were blowing away like sand in a high wind. I didn't have a choice, he whispered. With the money Julian lost at the tables, I thought I could keep the doors open until things got better. I could fix it. I did it for the name. You did it for yourself, I said. The door opened again. Silas Thorne walked in. He carried a scuffed tan leather briefcase. He didn't even glance at Arthur. He walked right to me and put a thick file on the wood. The split is finished, Silas said. His gravel voice was steady. I'm done working for the Vance estate. My firm works for Elena and her company now, only them. Arthur looked at Silas, then at me. Silas, we've been together 40 years. We were buddies. I was a friend to your wife, Arthur, Silas said, touching his silver-rimmed glasses. I promised her I would watch over her girl. It took me too long to see that meant keeping her safe from you. Silas handed me a pen. I signed the deal. The sound of the ink hitting the page was the only thing to hear. I sat there for a long moment after the signing was done. The office was high up, far above the noise of the street. I remembered how many years I had spent waiting for Arthur to give me a seat at his table. I had begged, worked myself to exhaustion, and stayed silent while he handed my hard work to a brother who didn't even know how to read a balance sheet. I realized then that I didn't want a seat at his table anymore. I had built my own, and it was stronger than his ever was. The weight that had been sitting in my chest since I was 20 years old finally lifted. It didn't seem like victory. It was air. We're finished, I said. Arthur stood up like his bones ached. He looked at Silas, then at me. He was waiting for a mean word or a lecture, a final punch. I gave him nothing. I just looked back at my monitor. He turned and headed for the exit. He moved like his years had finally caught up to him. His shoulders were hunched low. Arthur, I called out. He stopped. He turned around. A tiny bit of hope flickered in his face. He likely thought I was going to offer him a check or a job. You're the one nobody sees anymore, I said. The light in him died. He didn't say a word. He just walked out. The heavy glass door clicked shut. I worked late that night. On the drive home, I took the long way through Fairfield. I passed the car lot on the corner of 5th. I saw a man in a cheap, messy suit standing near the fence. He was pointing at the tires of a used sedan for a young couple. It was Julian. He looked worn out. He looked tiny. I didn't tap the brakes. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine. The quiet of the cab was a heavy blanket. I reached into my bag. I pulled out the old watch Grandma Rose left me. Arthur tried to sell it years ago, but I found it. I bought it back. I slid it onto my wrist. The silver was cold against my skin. I stepped out of the car. The only sound was the steady snap of my heels on the driveway. I didn't look back at the street. I didn't look back at the mess I left behind. I just opened my door and went inside. What would you have done? Would you have saved the old house or let the past burn down? Tell me what you think. 6 months after the truth finally broke the surface, the ink was still wet on the final page when Arthur Vance finally looked up, his face gray in the harsh office light. Silas Thorne and I had spent 3 nights in that high-rise office, finishing the paperwork that ended my father's reign. Arthur didn't fight the final clauses. He sat across from me, his hands trembling as he stared at the ledger of every cent he'd taken from my mother's life insurance and trust funds. Sign the last page, Arthur, Silas said, his voice like gravel. Then we're done. Arthur looked at me, his eyes red and tired. You've been the one behind Apex this whole time, all those contracts we lost. That was you. I was just doing the work you said I wasn't smart enough to handle, Dad, I said, my voice steady. I watched a bead of sweat roll down Arthur's temple. He looked smaller in his expensive leather chair than he ever had before. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to fill the long silence between us. He knew those records would do more than ruin his company. They would put him in a cage. Silas had been building the case for years, waiting for the moment Arthur's greed finally outpaced his caution. "Is that the last of it?" I asked, looking across the desk. "Every cent of your mother's trust is accounted for," Silas Thorne said, tapping the leather edge of his briefcase. "The money is back in your account. The handover is finished." Arthur Vance signed the papers with a shaking hand. He finally understood that the anonymous leader of Apex Optimization, the competitor who had been one by one dismantling his contracts for years, was the same daughter he dismissed as a failure. The legal weight of his choices had finally crushed him. The court-ordered settlement forced him to sell everything he owned to repay the stolen trust, and he was now legally barred from ever managing a trucking firm again. He wasn't just out of a job, he was stripped of the very status he had used to bully the world. The air in the room felt thin, like all the oxygen had been sucked out by the weight of those documents. Arthur's pen scratched loudly against the heavy paper one last time before he dropped it. "You're leaving me with nothing, Elena," he whispered. "I'm leaving you with exactly what you gave me," I told him. He effectively handed over the trucking business I'd already been running from the shadows. The truth was out now. Julian Vance didn't even show up for the final meeting. After failing to launch a single move to save the family business, he was already working at that car lot on 5th Street. I saw him there once, trying to sell a used sedan to a woman who didn't even look at him. The Vance freight sign came down a week later. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a long-overdue cleaning. I remember the smell of hot asphalt and gasoline as I drove past that car lot for the last time. Julian had been wearing a tie that was too short, looking at his scuffed shoes while a customer walked away from him. 6 months later, I bought a small stone cottage in Fairfield. The creek behind the house didn't care about corporate takeovers or stolen money. It just kept moving over the rocks, a constant, cold sound that filled the afternoon air. The air here smelled like pine needles and damp earth, not scotch and old secrets. I was already sitting on the back steps, cleaning a pair of gardening shears when Silas Thorne pulled up the gravel driveway. He still carried that weathered tan briefcase, but he wasn't wearing a suit. He had on a flannel shirt that made him look like a different person. "Nice place you've got here," Silas said, climbing the steps. He handed me a single envelope. "He sent another one," I said, not taking it. "He did," Silas said, leaning against the post beside me. I didn't open it. I knew what it said. Arthur Vance had been writing every week from the 2-bedroom condo he moved into after the estate was sold to pay off his debts. "Does he want money?" I asked. Silas shook his head. "He says he's lonely. He wants to see you." Silas looked out at the creek for a moment before continuing. "He told me, I only did what I did because I was terrified of being forgotten." He actually said he thought Julian was the only way to keep the Vance name alive. A blue jay landed on the porch railing, its sharp cry cutting through the quiet afternoon. I looked down at my hands, noticing a small smudge of garden soil on my thumb. I looked out at the water. That was the human truth of it. Arthur wasn't a monster from a story. He was just a man who let his pride turn into a sickness. He'd traded a daughter who loved him for a legacy that didn't exist. The vulnerability in his letters didn't change the fact that he'd left me with nothing when I needed him most. "Tell him no," I said. Silas waited, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Just no, nothing else." "I have nothing left to say to him," I replied. Silas Thorne nodded, tapped the railing of the porch, and walked back to his car. He didn't push. He knew me better than that. He left the letter on the small wooden table. I watched the dust settle after he drove away. My chest felt light, almost too light, as I sat there in the silence. It was the only body reaction I had left for the Vance family. The shaking was gone. The knots in my stomach had unraveled months ago. I sat on the porch swing and watched the sun dip below the trees. The woods were full of shadows, but they didn't feel heavy anymore. I thought about the Sunday mornings at the old house, years ago, before the greed took over. We used to make pancakes and fight over the crossword puzzle. That version of us was gone now. It wasn't because someone died. It was because the trust had been burned down to the ground. I sat with that loss for a long time, letting the quiet of the woods wrap around me. It was better to be alone in the truth than together in a lie. The kitchen was small and clean, smelling like the coffee I'd made an hour ago. I sat at the counter where my laptop sat open, the screen glowing with the growth charts for Apex optimization. We were now the largest logistics firm in the tri-state area, with 300 employees and a new headquarters in Norristown. I closed the laptop lid with a soft click. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, steady and sure. I remembered 2012. I was 22 years old, sitting in a laundromat at 3 a.m. I was eating a piece of day-old bread I'd bought for 50 cents. I had a library book on supply chain theory in my lap and a secret notebook full of dreams, the very blueprints I'd used to build Apex, that I thought would never come true. I remembered the shadow at the library door back then. I knew now it had been Sela's thorn, sent by Grandma Rose to watch over me when I had nothing. She had been the one who saw Arthur's greed early on and funded my start through Sela's, making sure I had a fighting chance even when my own father tried to erase me. I wasn't that girl anymore. I had built my own foundation, brick by brick, while they weren't looking. I reached into my jewelry box on the shelf and pulled out the watch Grandma Rose had left me. It was silver and simple. I slid it onto my wrist and listened to the steady, rhythmic tick. It was the only thing from the past I chose to keep. I walked to the front door and turned the lock. The house was mine. My name was on the deed. My life was finally my own. I didn't need a seat at Arthur's table, because I had built the whole house. There is a specific kind of peace that only comes after you stop waiting for an apology that will never be sincere. If you finally reached the top of the mountain alone, and the person who tried to push you off was now reaching up from the bottom, would you reach back or keep walking? Tell me your choice in the comments. And that's my story. Thank you for staying until the end. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand up for yourself in a family that made you feel invisible, I want you to know you're not alone. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. I read every single one. Hit like if this meant something to you, and subscribe for more stories like this.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.